This is the second video in the PEI lecture. We will cover transducers. Please watch the pulsar beamformer video first. The last lecture discussed the components of the transmitter, which were the pulsar and the beamformer, the channels, and the TR switch. After the beamformer, the electrical energy is sent to the transducer. The transducer waits for echoes to return, returning electrical energy back to the beamformer, and then that energy is sent to the receiver for processing. Today's lecture is going to focus on the transducer piece of it. So much time of physics is dedicated to the transducer, so we have really covered in depth how and why they work. But the main thing you need to know that their role in pulse echo instrumentation is that it converts energy. So as that energy comes from the beamformer and hits the crystals of the transducer, its electrical energy is changed into acoustic energy during transmission. During reception then, acoustic energy is transferred into electrical energy, which is then used by the machine for processing. The rest of this lecture then is going to go over some thoughts on how the transducers and machines work together to create optimal pictures. This is going to depend on how the transducer is made and what the machine's capabilities are. The first concept is bandwidth. Bandwidth is the idea that transducers do not operate at one frequency. They actually have a range of frequencies besides the main frequency that the machine can operate it at. Shorter pulses are going to have a broader bandwidth when compared to longer pulses. This is due to the damping material and the characteristics of wavelength and frequency. There are many benefits of having a wide bandwidth, those being multi-hertz operation, dynamic frequency tuning, and harmonic imaging. We'll touch on multi-hertz operation and dynamic frequency tuning in a moment. Harmonic imaging will come later this semester. So in the last few years, ultrasound has revolutionized by the ability to produce ultra-wide bandwidth transducers. The wider the bandwidth, the more options there are for operating a transducer at. When we think of bandwidth, we need to think about all the elements that are making up the whole sound beam. So lower frequency portions of the sound beam are going to have a longer wavelength and greater penetration, where higher frequency portions of the sound beam are going to have shorter wavelengths and better axial resolution. So higher frequencies have good resolution, lower frequencies are better at penetrating. And then you kind of have a general sound beam or frequency that's kind of good at both resolution and penetration, but not really excellent at either. I mentioned earlier that multi-hertz was one of the benefits to having a wide bandwidth. So multi-hertz function on a machine allows the sonographer to change frequencies without changing a probe. This has really been advanced over the years. Multi-hertzing has been around since the latter part of the 80s, but the ultra-wide bandwidth transducers are a newer function of ultrasound systems. When multi-hertzing originally began, it was maybe the difference between choosing a 2 MHz and a 2.5 MHz, where now the transducer designs give us a range from 5 MHz to 12 MHz. Multi-hertz is a function on your machine that you should figure out how to use. It's actually part of your physics paper this semester as well. So hop on a machine and see what switching through those multi-hertz frequencies does for your image. Oftentimes, if you need to penetrate a little bit more, we're going to lower that frequency. If you can do with a higher frequency because you're imaging shallower, then you want to use a higher frequency. It'll help a lot with how your pictures look and your gain options and the detail that you're seeing. Another benefit I had mentioned was dynamic frequency tuning, or DFT. So we know that short pulses equal a better axial resolution, and that better axial resolution comes along with having a high frequency transducer and with dampening material. Systems that have dynamic frequency tuning are going to use higher frequencies to insonate the superficial structures of a picture. They're going to use medium frequencies for mid-depth imaging and then lower frequencies for deeper portions. Not all machines are equipped with this feature, but it's important to know how it functions. So again, a little bit more about dynamic frequency tuning. We have our bandwidth here showing us resolution, general, and penetration portions of frequencies that our transducer can operate at. When we use dynamic frequency tuning, the resolution part is used to image that first part of the image. The general frequency is then used to image the second part of the image, and penetration is used for the deepest part of the image. It's really utilizing what each frequency is really good at. High frequencies are good at shallow, detailed imaging or resolution. General frequencies are kind of our workhorse. They kind of can do just about everything. They can do a little bit of resolution, a little bit of penetration. So they're good for those mid-range levels. And then penetration is what we really need to image all the way through the body, especially in larger habitus patients. Quality factor is another unitless number that kind of gives us an idea of how a transducer is functioning and what the image will look like. So quality factor is a measure of the frequency bandwidth of a transducer. There is an equation for quality factor. It is the operating frequency divided by the bandwidth. So if our operating frequency is 5 megahertz, but our bandwidth ranges from 2 to 10 megahertz, that means our bandwidth is 8 and our operating frequency is 5. Our Q factor then is 5 divided by 8. When we have high Q transducers, they are going to have narrow bandwidth and poor axial resolution. These three things are often found in low frequency transducers. The opposite of that then is true as well. Low Q transducers have a wide bandwidth, superior axial resolution, which are typically found with high frequency transducers. So here's another look at all the information that I just kind of presented to you. On this side, on the left side of the screen, we have our low frequency transducer. We have a long pulse duration here, which means that it is ringing for a very long time. When we have low frequency transducers, that pulse is going to last longer, so it rings for a long time. Low frequency transducers then create a narrow bandwidth. This one has a range from 3.5 to 4.5, so our bandwidth is 1. Low frequency transducers also have low axial resolution. They're better at penetrating. So low axial resolution with low frequency transducers, high penetration capabilities when we're using a low frequency transducer, and all of this put together means that low frequency transducers have a high Q factor. The opposite then is true. When we use a high frequency transducer, our pulse duration is very short. The pulse is going to ring for a very short amount of time, and this creates a very wide bandwidth. We have 2.5 to 6.5, our bandwidth is at 4 in this example. High frequency transducers are associated with high axial resolution, but low penetration. When we put all of these factors together, we get a low Q factor. It seems counterintuitive between high and low Q factors, but just remember, low Q factor means good pictures, good resolution. All right, so it's time to test yourself again. Number 1, a sonographer is using a 15 megahertz transducer. Which of the following is true? A, the bandwidth is narrow. B, the penetration is superior. C, the axial resolution is poor. Or D, the Q factor is low. Number 2, when using DFT, what order would the bandwidth be used in from top to bottom of a sector? A, res gen pen. B, res pen gen. C, pen gen res. Or D, gen res pen. And number 3, which order of energy movement is correct? Is it A, pulsar to beamformer to transducer to the receiver? Is it B, beamformer to transducer to body to transducer to beamformer? C, pulsar, beamformer, body, transducer, receiver? Or D, pulsar, transducer, body, beamformer?